Yeah, nice to meet you, Jessica. And let me introduce you to everyone, and then you can take it away and yeah, tell us what you have to tell us. So Jessica, she's the executive director of ASAP Bio. And I reached out to Dora to ask for some speakers, and they referred me to Jessica when I told them what we were doing. And I think they put the nail on the head. So Jessica is a PhD in biochemistry from the University of California, San Francisco. And she did her postdoctoral research in the Department of System Biology at Harvard Medical School. And she is in the steering committee of an organization called Rescuing Biomedical Research. And from there, she went on to become the executive director of ASAP Bio, which is an organization dedicated to accelerating biomedical science, which fits really well with our own mission at ResearchHub, where we also have as a motto to accelerate science. And so they referred me to her based on what we were doing. And Jessica told me she was going to talk about the problem of quality assessment. Once we have preprints out everywhere, then the question is, how do we ascertain what is high quality, what is low quality, and what can we trust? So Jessica, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Let me just say that, I come from this background, I think like many people here today, of, thinking about the experience of being an early career researcher and kind of being affected by a lot of the incentives that I think are not necessarily perfectly well aligned with publishing research that is the most collaborative and maybe the most rigorous. I think that the career structure of the biomedical research workforce kind of is not necessarily at odds with the type of publishing that we really need if we're going to be tackling global challenges. And I think that, just a little bit of background about ASAP Bio, we're a small nonprofit organization that I helped to co-found after doing a postdoc and being, looking for ways to help this situation and maybe help align scientific publishing better with desires to be creative and collaborative and all those things. So I think that the origin of ASAP Bio really came in this study that our founder, Ron Vale, did, which was looking at how long it takes grad students to come out with their first paper. So in the 80s, this used to be less than 5 years. But despite the fact that we now have computers and the internet, in 30 years later, it was actually taking a year longer. So what is this? We now have instrumentation, we have the tools to make science go faster, and yet it's actually going slower. Why? I think that one component is that over this time period, the drive for publishing in high impact papers, publishing in high impact journals has kind of encouraged people to put more and more and more into a single paper, so that, in the 80s, these journals didn't even have supplemental figures, but even if you left those out, the number of panels inside those articles was several times smaller than it is today. So I think that, there's really a situation where there's a lot more data coming out, but people are holding on to it and trying to craft this really long narrative out of it. And again, it's because, of this quality control process that we have in place that is, I think right now, inhibiting the sharing of science. So how do we get around this? I mean, I think that right now we have this situation where publishing is really multiple different components all together. There is a dissemination angle, there's peer review and curation and prestige that all together are wrapped up in traditional journal publishing. So if you're going to play this game, you're going to try to make sure that you have the best and most convincing story possible before you actually disseminate your work. But I want to talk about a few different approaches to disrupting this bundling that enables people to actually share earlier. So micropublications, of course, just do the same thing, but with a smaller unit. Everyone agrees that it's going to be a smaller unit. I think that's definitely working. Pre-registration and registered reports. Let's actually perform peer review, maybe on just the study design. I do think that that is also an incredibly effective tool that is dependent upon different experimental workflows in different disciplines. And then, of course, there's multiple people who are just putting stuff up online, kind of eschewing the entire article format altogether, building custom websites. And, you know, they're definitely interesting experiments in this space, like eLife. But I want to highlight today models that focus on a publish then review approach, where first people can disseminate their work with preprints, and then journals, peer review services, and curation projects can come in and evaluate it. And I think that this is really going to be the future of publishing, where you have both the rapid dissemination as well as some kind of quality control, if you like. And I think that there's a lot of reasons why we need to evolve the peer review process. But hopefully we can talk a little bit about why I think there still needs to be some information, ways to filter information and give context to readers. So I think probably most people are aware of preprints, but they enable this kind of emergence of work out into the public during the time that it would otherwise be undergoing this review process that is hidden from the public view. And while articles are out on preprint servers, and here we've drawn this diagram to indicate that many people are just posting the manuscript that they'd submit to a journal. In fact, a lot of preprints can also be posted in advance of journal submission or separately from journal submission. There's no reason why a preprint needs to be submitted at the same time as a journal article, except that is sort of the convention. And it's a way that preprints have allowed to kind of come alongside the journal workflow in life sciences. So preprints are not reviewed by the server, right? And this is what enables them to be posted rapidly. And this is, I think, the key feature that enables us to think about whether they're going to be, whether there's going to be some kind of quality control or quality signaling. They're versions, so they can be easily updated or corrected, which I think is also impacting this entire notion of review and feedback, that the article is not static. It's something that is changing. It's compatible with journals, it can be citable, and really a lot of funders are now acknowledging preprints as evidence of productivity. But I would say that culturally, it's not necessarily seen as equivalent as a journal article. And that's because, again, people are looking to those journal titles as a way to provide a shorthand signifier for the quality of information. So there are I think now over 600,000 life sciences preprints. Basically, bioRxiv launched in 2013. And so there's really been this sharp growth, especially during COVID, and now it's kind of plateauing, where we have a pretty steady rate of preprinting that has been supported by funder policies. So funders like the Simons Foundation, I believe the Simons Foundation was the first to really have a formal preprint policy that supported the use of preprints for demonstrating productivity for grant applications and reports. And this has been followed by lots of funders, both public and private in the United States, as well as in Europe and even in Latin America as well. So I would say also that I think something interesting here is that there are a number of different preprint servers in operation. So bioRxiv, I think, as well as PeerJ preprints were the first to launch in 2013. But now there's many more. And I think one thing that is really notable here is that a lot of these are actually commercial servers. And I'll get to that in just a minute. But we're able to generate this graph. This graph is actually from Europe PMC because preprints are now being indexed by Crossref. They're appearing on PubMed. And eLife has now, as you may know, launched this new publishing model that really centers on preprints. and does away with accept, reject decisions, but instead posts the reviews on preprints. So while this growth is impressive, I would say that we still have to keep in mind that in the life sciences, the volume of preprints being posted per month is about 10% of the volume of papers being posted to PubMed. So still, preprinting is a minority practice, even though it has grown a lot over the course of the last few years. And what I want to highlight here is that these preprint servers, some of which are owned by nonprofit entities like Cold Spring Harbor, the majority of these other preprint servers, and of course there's SIPS, which runs SciArchive, which is on the Open Science Framework. A lot of these other servers are actually owned or affiliated with commercial publishers. And I think that this is a really important thing to consider as we head into Open Access Week later this fall in the Northern Hemisphere. And I think that's something that we are at ASAP Bio are going to be running an event about. But the point being that if we want to think about how to remove control of scientific communication from a very gatekeeping and commercialized space, that I think we need to think about the governance of these community preprint servers and where people are putting their work. I will say that, like, for example, Research Square, on everything on there is actually CC BY. So I think that is a fantastic step in making sure that the content can be reused and fostering innovation. But as far as like, I think probably the theme of this conference on decentralization, right? I mean, I think that this picture is painting a very centralized image of how people are sharing data. But I think that one way that preprints are being shared in a less centralized way is through institutional repositories. So we did a survey with the Coalition of Open Access Repositories. And we found that most of the repositories who responded don't have very many preprints, but they're just in this sorted plot. There's a few that really have quite a few thousand preprints. And unfortunately, because the metadata is sort of unclear, we don't really know how many of these preprints have their only home on the institutional repository, or whether they're just an archived copy of something that appears on arXiv or bioRxiv or something like that. So I think that this is an example, though, of universities and libraries wanting to support their own researchers in sharing science in a way that doesn't rely necessarily on infrastructure or commercial entities. So that said, I think that the services that are actually offering preprinting, archiving, don't necessarily offer the same kind of technological supports as a preprint server per se. So these institutional repositories are 60% of the time linking to the final version of the article, but a third of them are, for example, not doing that. Some are assigning DOIs, some are offering support for versioning, but in general, this is not something that is really offered to the same degree of standardization as it is in traditional preprint servers. Okay, so I'm going to skip that slide in the interest of time. But just to say that, I think that on this whole concept of moving science into a more decentralized place and removing barriers to sharing, I really think the preprints are exceptionally good at doing this. So there's this wonderful paper called Preprint Match that appeared earlier this year, in which the authors used a tool to create linkages between preprints and final published articles. And what they found was that for countries that have a sort of high income countries, the preprints by those authors were getting converted into journal papers like 2/3 of the time. But in the low and middle income countries, a much smaller fraction of preprints go on to be published in journal articles. And I think that you could come up with a lot of like theories about why this is the case. Like, for example, a lot of people who are skeptical about preprints will say, you know, if a preprint hasn't been published in a journal, then why should I read it? Because it probably got rejected. But as an alternative, you know, explanation, publishing in a journal takes a lot of money in some cases. It takes money not only for the article processing charges or page charges, but also for reagents that are necessary to perform revisions. It takes time. It takes a stable group of researchers. If your grad student leaves, or if your, you know, postdoc leaves or something, how are you going to, or you know, maybe don't have a stable position as the PI, how are you going to finish that paper? And indeed, in this study, the papers reporting external funding were also more likely to be published in journal articles, excuse me, in journals. But I think that, you know, this points to this notion that all of these papers that are appearing as preprints, but not getting published as journal articles. You know, one way of thinking about this is that this is science that is going to be hidden. And by actually enabling people to share it without this protracted publishing process, that's a way to get more research out there. And there's a variety of different papers now looking at comparing the data reported in preprints and the data reported in journal articles, and finding that there's not a huge amount of variation in for example, in these epidemiological estimate values reported in this study, and also not a strong correlation between the quality scores of preprints that go on to get published versus those that don't. So I am certain that peer review improves papers, and peer review has many other functions, including like sorting things into interest levels and highlighting what's going to be interesting to different audiences. But I think that all of this points to the fact that we need a more nuanced way of kind of evaluating papers and evaluating research. Okay, I'm just gonna breeze through this in just a moment. I think that, you know, getting back to this anxiety of preprints as things that are potentially sources of misinformation, because, you know, they're not peer reviewed. Well, first, I have a few, you know, thoughts about that. One being that clearly, unfortunately, our peer review process is not a bulletproof way to make something true, and that there's, in fact, there may be a false sense of security for basically putting something through a peer review process and then assuming that one can simply trust that because it's been peer reviewed, it is correct. But nevertheless, there's no peer review happening on preprint servers. And this means that even things that are more obviously problematic, shall we say, will go through. So early in the pandemic, this paper appeared on bioRxiv, positing that there was some sort of similarity between HIV and SARS-CoV-2. But within just a couple hours, there was a huge response on Twitter and in the comment section, which bioRxiv does a very nice job of linking directly under the author list of the preprint. And this response from the community actually led several news outlets to pick up on the controversy and report on that, rather than picking up and reporting wholesale the paper itself. And within 48 hours of this paper being posted, the authors actually decided to withdraw it, which is an unthinkable turnaround time if one were to consider something appearing in a journal, waiting several weeks for the correspondences to come in, you know, and back and forth. So yes, I think that preprints enable rapid sharing with fewer barriers, and that can create problems, but it also provides a way to more rapidly activate like this kind of immune system of the community. Now, I've showed you a really dramatic edge case of how online community discussion can help correct misinformation. But I think what's happening much more frequently is simply that there are open commentaries on preprints that help readers and others understand the paper and help this kind of quality filtering. So bioRxiv is integrating with a bunch of different feedback providers. So for example, they have this little tab here where formalized peer reviews can appear. And I think what's interesting about preprints is that we have less of reviewers acting as a gatekeeper function, because the paper is already out there. It's not as though they're guarding this publication, getting a sell paper, getting a scarce resource. Rather, it's more about providing context and providing help to the authors in improving their paper. So let me just go through here and say that, like, for example, there's a lovely demonstration from Dan Quintana, who posted a preprint that he wrote on a discussion group on Facebook, and actually found a collaborator who became a co-author in this way. And I would say that because preprints really dispense with the need for peer review to fulfill this very specific function, we now have a huge variety of different experiments that are being in play here. From on top of this layer of preprint servers, there's all of these preprint feedback initiatives that I think are addressing this problem of quality and quality signaling, as not at the level of what gets displayed on the preprint, but rather what are the readers going to see, and how are the readers going to make sense of the paper. And then what's interesting is that these range from very minimalist to kind of like more journal-like. So for example, eLife's new process, there's no accept reject decision, but they still use a controlled vocabulary, which I should say is really novel, to signal to readers the importance of the findings and how rigorous they seem to be. And there's also these other initiatives like Biophysics Collab, Review Commons, Peer Community In, that are essentially operating an editor organized peer review process on top of a preprint. But as we go down this like slide here, I think that there's a lot of other choices. So for example, Prelights is kind of really like a news and views type article written by an early career researcher highlighting a preprint that they find interesting. So there's all of these kind of your review and curation systems that are appearing on top of preprints, as well as tools to kind of identify them, sort them, and organize them. So for example, Review Commons was launched by ASAP Bio together with EMBO. And it offers, on top of preprints, a single round of review. And then the reviewers are instructed just to pay attention to the science, not any potential journal. And there's a group of originally 17, but now even further, affiliate journals who agree not to restart the peer review. They'll just take the peer review and then offer this like curation and prestige by way of accepting or rejecting or performing additional review on that paper. And Peer Community In, I think, does something even more extensive, where they really go through this whole editorial process, but they enable journals to also publish the paper. So the preprint reviews are definitely growing over time, but I need to highlight that this is like still a tiny fraction of 1% of all the preprints out there, of all the papers out there. So really this territory that we're talking about is really, really new. And I think as it scales, these ways of measuring what is important, what passes some sort of bar, what is believable, we're going to see more and more demands for that. And is that going to be looking like filtering on like a rank? Will it look like accepting? I think there's a drive to move away from binary accept reject decisions. But when you have a scalar value for quality, where do you draw the line? And I think this comes up most pragmatically in questions about indexing. If you're going to look at PubMed, what are you going to include for when papers are, the editor is saying that the paper is flawed, for example? Do you want that to show up in your search results? Yeah, I think that's an interesting question to provoke the discussion. But nevertheless, we're starting to see some formal recognition for preprint peer review, both by Plan S, which is this coalition of funders, especially in Europe, who are promoting open access, as well as in the context of recognizing early career researchers. We are kind of working and thinking about preprint review and how does one draw the line? Like, well, how do you say a paper has been reviewed? Where do you draw the line between just like a comment and a peer review? And so we've mulled over some of these questions there. But I want to also just end on the fact that the European Council in May made a call for no fee publishing, what they call no fee publishing model. The idea being that open access comes at a huge cost to researchers, whether that's through article processing charges or transformative agreements entered into by their libraries. And, I think what we need to make scholarly publishing really equitable is actually a model where the cost of publishing is borne directly by funders and institutions. And I think that preprints and these peer review layers can actually offer this and offer a more community-owned way of publishing research in the future. So with that, I want to say thank you to the organizers, and I'd be happy to answer any questions now or over email.
Well, thank you, Jessica. Yeah, very insightful talk. Thanks for sharing your knowledge. All the graphs really illustrate the point. Ties in really nicely into what we have been doing. Let me see. I don't see any questions from the audience. I took a couple of notes. Maybe I can also ask you about that. I think one interesting aspect thing that I would like to know about is when you were talking about the institutional repositories as like an alternative to decentralized ownership structure of preprint servers, because that is something that actually every university has, like not every, but like generally they have it. And then there's a way to like access all these papers. The difficulty is kind of like the findability and the aggregating here. And there's this one interesting project, I think it's called Core, COAR Notify project, but I cannot try to interlink them. And like this is something that to me makes a lot of sense, because when I was first starting to think about decentralizing science, I thought the ideal way would be if the universities would be the nodes in the network that actually make sure that the record is maintained, right? Like in a blockchain, you have nodes, and then they would work like this. So every institutional repository should be or could be that. Can you maybe talk a little bit about this Notify project? Do you know more about it than I do maybe, and can explain how that could enable such a decentralized way of maintaining the literature, and then also the links and the quality assessment between different papers? Yeah,
absolutely. So the Notify project is, as you mentioned, supported by the Coalition of Open Access Repositories. And the idea is really just that every single repository or peer review service is able to send notifications to one another saying, I have a paper here for review. I'm going to review your paper. I've completed the review, without any single centralized way of transmitting that information. In other words, that it's transmitted directly from a repository to preprint service, preprint review service, and back and forth. I think that's a really interesting and exciting idea that I believe actually has a kind of really solid foundation in this idea of autonomy and the fact that you don't necessarily want to rely on, for example, an entity that is minting DOIs and charging large fees for that. But on the other hand, having this distributed approach can make it more difficult to create the kind of index of all of the that a researcher might want to just browse a single catalog. So I think that there's pros and cons, and we're going to have a workshop together with Europe PMC in October to talk about these different ways of transferring metadata around reviews and preprints. But Core Notify is really an exciting project that is going to be represented in that conversation. Thank you.
Maybe if I can respond to that and like add a little bit to the question. Thank you for enlightening it a little bit. It brings back to mind a conversation that I once had with them about, like, it seems to be like they're sort of like the internet of research papers in a sense, and trying to connect them together. So that would mean that you have to upload to your own institutional repository, for example, the review, to then be able to link those. But what I see here as like a challenge seems to be the UX, because I had to upload my thesis into that thing too, and it was not great. It's not how I want to interact on a, like, not in the most natural way. I would open Twitter to make a comment, and then that's even not ideal. So is there a way for this to like work out and to like collaborate in a sense where we can improve the UX of this feature so that we could actually benefit from it in a quicker way? Because oftentimes that for the diffusion of innovation, that is what really drives the actual innovation, right? Is there, yeah.
Yeah, and right. And I also think that the kind of idea of actually relying on universities are wonderful, but I also feel like there's scholars who are unaffiliated or scholars who don't have the same, resources as those who might have a university who can create like a beautiful institutional repository for them. But nevertheless, I do think that there are more tools now that can provide, more of a distributed network. Like, so for example, Ludo Waltman, who I know was speaking earlier in this conference, uses PubPub to write reviews. And that is something where that's a really very modern tool that is designed to be able to reference work elsewhere. So I do agree that like UX is incredibly important. And I would say that even the motivation for scholarly publishing is so much driven by career needs and prestige that I feel like even the most profit-minded like commercial publishers are not really nailing this UX thing. So I think there's really a lot of opportunity for innovation in that space.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I have another question, if I can. It's kind of tangential, but I'm pretty sure that you can give a pretty good insight into this. I want to talk about open peer review, the concept of open peer review. So we've been experimenting a bit with kind of like peer review on ResearchHub. So we're trying to get people to basically upload preprints and do peer review, and trying to like reward them to do so. And something that we've been finding like a challenge is balancing, the openness of I want to do an open peer review, so have people see who I am, see my skills, my expertise, so they can trust what I say. But at the same time, if my name is up there and have to kind of like do a peer review of like a prestigious scientist, there's also that I could be afraid of like saying something that might kind of like backlash to me. And so there's probably there's not a clear answer. Like, where do you think is the balance in between this openness, but also kind of like preserving your own status, I would say?
Yeah, it's such a tricky issue. I think that, a lot of people, there's a couple of really interesting, I think, first of all, it's possible to be open with the content of the peer review without necessarily signing it. And I think that is something that is probably more universally more comfortable for a lot of people. I definitely feel that, people, there's a lot of concerns both ways, that if you sign your review, you're going to be open to retribution, but also there's this concern, like, if people have to sign their reviews, then they're going to pull their punches because they don't want to actually be too offensive or something like that. So, I mean, I think that there's it's an incredibly important topic. I would love to be able to say, like, everybody should just sign their reviews because you'll get credit for it. But frankly, the credit, there's no real formalized credit for peer review anyway, which I feel like its own separate problem. I do think that I want to highlight that pre-review, the service pre-review has a really nice solution to this, which is that they offer you the ability to post a review under a pseudonym. And then at some point in the future, when you feel more comfortable, perhaps in your career or some time has passed, whatever, you can then flip your pseudonym to actually display your own name and your own ORCID ID. And so I think that's a really nice way of saying, like, you know, here's an identity. I'm not going to tie it to myself, but it is there and I can claim it at some point in the future.
Is there a way for someone else to see that pseudonym have like a kind of like a specific expertise, so I can see that you that have that specific expertise wrote that peer review, so I can kind of like, I know that the content of the peer review should be self-standing, but if I see that you have done this kind of work in that specific domain, I might understand why you're telling me specific things or not. So is there a way for that?
I don't know that pre-review has implemented that. I mean, I could imagine that if with some sort of like, you know, authentication from the maybe a person verifying certain things. I feel like that could be an interesting feature to play around with, but I don't believe that pre-review is doing that at this time.
Yeah, that's a clever solution because you kind of want to build your reputation over time, and then when you can kind of like unlock it and let people see, hey, it was actually me. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. Bye.